سوف نبقى هنا كي يزول الألم سوف نحيا هنا سوف يحلو النغم موطني ذا الإباء موطني يا أنا رغم كيد العدا رغم كل النقم سوف نسعى إلى أن تعم النعم سوف نرنو إلى رفع كل الهمم بالمسير للعلا ومناجاة القمم فلنقم كلنا بالدواء والقلم.
الرحمن الرحيم. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Salatu wassalamu ala Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters, and welcome back to Islamic Oasis Live. Today, alhamdulillah, we're blessed to have Dr. Abdul Wahid today to speak with us about a bit of a morose or melancholic anniversary, which is a century passing since the abolition of the Ottoman Caliphate, the Ottoman Khilafah. This is a very momentous event in the history of Islam, as the Ottoman Caliphate was a continuation of previous Islamic polities, extending from the time of the Khilafah Rashidun to Banu al-Abbas or Banu al-Umayyah, and then Banu al-Abbas, and then the Ottomans as well. So, after 100 years, inshallah, this is a very apt time to have a retrospective about, the impact that it had in the world, as well as what it means for us today as Muslims. Alhamdulillah, Dr. Abdul Wahid is a political commentator as well as a Muslim activist. He has spoken, alhamdulillah, on many platforms, such as 5 Pillars and Islam 21C. And he has various talks throughout the years, subhanAllah, of raising awareness, especially regarding the Caliphate, on the impact that the Ottoman Caliphate has had. So I definitely recommend some of our viewers to check out as well the other topics that other lectures that he's given on this topic. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Abdul Wahid. Welcome back to Islamic Oasis Live. It's always a pleasure to have you on here.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Brother Zain, and to all brothers and sisters watching out there.
So, like we said before, Dr. Abdul Wahid is giving his presentation today regarding the topic of the abolition of the Khilafah. Again, he is speaking in individual capacity. So, inshallah, without further ado, I'll pass it over into your presentation. All right.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalam ala rasulillah, ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri. Wahlul uqtadam min lisani yafqahu qawli. Thank you, Brother Zain. I have done this presentation. I sometimes prepare these slides. They kind of keep me on track. Otherwise, I end up rambling quite a lot. And feel free to interrupt if you have some questions. We are talking about, as you say, a very morose subject. 100 years ago, on the 3rd of March, 1924, which equates to the 28th of Rajab, 1342 Hijri, there was a formal abolition of the Khilafah in Ankara, Turkey, by Mustafa Kamal. Actually, Brother Zain, if you can move down a couple of slides, there's a image that some of your viewers might be familiar with, which is a newspaper headline. Keep going down, 1, 2, 3. Yeah. So this is from a newspaper on the 3rd of March itself, with the title, The Abolition of the Caliphate, the Decision of the Turkish Assembly, Abdul Majid deposed, from Istanbul, Constantinople, the 3rd of March, the motion for the abolition of the caliphate was passed in the Grand National Assembly today after a stormy debate. And we're going to come back to that issue of the stormy debate. One more slide on, please. So this gentleman in the middle of the photograph is the last Khalifa of the Muslims, Sultan Abdul Majid II, on the day when the abolition happened. And part of the deal on that day was not just the office of the Khalifa should be abolished, but he was to be sent into exile so that he posed no threat to the new Turkish Republic. Next slide, please. This is a photograph of Sultan Abdul Majid II. He was exiled to France. He lived there for 20 years. He died in 1944. When he died, it was almost unthinkable that a Khalifa of the Muslims could be buried in France. So his body actually lay in the mosque in Paris, I believe, for several days, whilst there was a debate and a diplomatic effort to decide where he should be buried. And Turkey refused to have him buried there. There was heavy negotiations with different countries. And eventually his body was transferred to Al-Madinah, and he is buried in Jannatul Baqi, which is a pretty amazing thing when you think that the third Khalifa of the Muslims, Uthman bin Affan radiallahu anh, is buried there. And after his reign, Khilafah moved away from Medina. So the last Khalifa of the Muslims was returned there after his death. Next slide, please. So we want to talk about what actually happened on that day of the 3rd of March. And we want to learn some things. This is not, I would say this is not just a history lesson, because just knowing the history for the sake of the history is not really the issue. There are things that happened at that time that led up to this matter that we need to learn from, because they inform our world today and the situation of Muslims in the Muslim world today. The abolition of the Khilafah was the end of a long process. Actually, within Turkey, as it was in 1922, Mustafa Kamal in the Grand National Assembly had abolished the Sultanate. If through most of the time of the Uthmani Khilafah, the Sultan, the head of the authority in the Khilafah, was also the Khalifa. That was not always the case. So the Sultan, the leaders of the Ottoman state, were actually originally just referred to as the Sultan, but once they actually unified with the Hijaz, from that point onwards, they were known as the Khalifa when they had rule over Mecca, Medina, and Al-Quds. So until 1922, that was the case, and the Sultanate was abolished in 1922. Its powers were subsumed into the Grand National Assembly. And in 1923, Mustafa Kamal actually abolished the Ottoman state, and he declared a Turkish republic. But the Khalifa continued to live in Istanbul and was seen as a figurehead for the Muslims. But despite being a weak Khalifa and a figurehead with no real power, Sultan Abdul Majid did actually voice his opinion on certain matters, which led just a few months after the abolition of the Ottoman state to this very hurried and abolition of the Khilafah altogether. He was seen as a threat. Next slide, please. This was seen as a victory for Western ideas, and I will explain why. Next slide. This is the man responsible, Mustafa Kamal, commonly known as Ataturk, the father of the Turks. On the left-hand side, we see a photograph of him. As an Ottoman officer, decorated, seen as a war hero for his role in Gallipoli in the World War One, seen as a war hero after World War One when he led a operation against a Greek rebellion against the Ottoman state. But after he assumed power and abolished the Khilafah, he imposed a series of Western values on what was left as Turkey, which we'll discuss. And I think the photograph on the right represents that very well. You see an Ottoman soldier on the left, and you see somebody who could be considered an English gentleman on the right. Now, even if you adopt Western values in your politics, it takes a pre-colonized person to want to dress like he is dressed now. I say he died in Istanbul in 1938 and buried. He's not yet buried. His body lies in a mausoleum in Istanbul. He died of cirrhosis of the liver. He was a heavy drinker of alcohol. Originally, his remains were put in a museum in Ankara, but they were transferred into a mausoleum. So they're not actually buried. It's very like the way the pharaohs used to bury themselves or rest their own bodies. Next slide, please. So I want to mention this man. We talked in the previous slide of there was a heated debate in the 3rd of March. Sayyid Bey was a member of the Grand National Assembly, the Ottoman Parliament. His background was that he was madrasa educated, graduated from the Istanbul University Faculty of Law, and actually used to teach fiqh at that university, and was in the Ottoman Parliament before the abolition of the Khilafah. So he is a man who has some legal background as well as some Islamic knowledge background, teacher of fiqh. But something has happened in the Uthmani Khilafah by this stage in the period of time Sayyid Bey was in the Turkish National Assembly. This man argued in the assembly to abolish the Khilafah, and he tried to argue this on the basis of Islamic arguments, which is completely bizarre when you think about it. But actually, if you like, what it represents and what we see today is this reformist, or I may call it a deformist approach to fiqh, where somebody who has some Islamic qualifications sometimes plays gymnastics with the fiqh to justify a conclusion that they've pre-decided. And this was something that had happened in the period of decline. And we're going to discuss a little bit later how that reformist agenda had taken place. But it's important to understand that it was no small thing for Muslims in Turkey in 1924 to abolish the Khilafah. It was a heated debate. This man's intervention is seen historically as very decisive because he was seen to have some Islamic arguments, in quotes, or pseudo-Islamic arguments supporting the abolition of Khilafah. Next slide, please. There is a very interesting book written by a historian, a Turkish historian called Nurullah Ardic, and I've taken a few quotes from this, where I'm not going to read this in detail, but he goes through the events that happened both in 1922 and 23, and then in 24. And he said in this, the relevant part of this, in late 22 and 23, they had to prepare the Muslim public in Turkey for that which they had again used the knowledge and power and capacity of a famous scholar, Sayyid Bey. On the other hand, they had to fight against modernist Islamists such as Khaja Sukru and Lutfi Fikri. And there was he calls it the battle of the pamphlets, where one side versus the other arguing about whether or not the Khilafah should be abolished. Next slide, please. Still, he says, it was a shock to everyone. And it was not an easy process for the secularists, even by this era of in this era of decline. He says they had to frame everything they did in religious terms and find a way to transcend the tension between the universal Islamic institution of the Khilafah and that the power needed to lie in the GNA, the Grand National Assembly that they controlled in Ankara. So, if they took power into Ankara, the Khalifa was still there in Istanbul and there was a fear he'd still have a voice. That's the reality they were debating at this time in 1924. Next slide, please. And when I said this is a victory for Western values, well, this is a copy from The Economist magazine dated the 8th of March 1924 on this huge geopolitical event. The repudiation of the Caliphate by Turks marks an epoch in the expansion of Western ideas over the non-Western world. In the end, this matter was a matter which was seen in the West as a triumph of their system, their way of government over an Islamic system. And it's another lesson to take. And we see this all the time at the moment with a projection of Western values into the Muslim world. This was happening a century ago or more to try and convince people to change the system according to a Western system. And again, we're going to trace how that happened. So we have 2 or 3 parallel processes going on here. One is a power struggle, where Mustafa Kamal eventually takes power and abolishes the office of Khilafah, which he sees as a rival. 2 is a distortion of Islamic jurisprudence to pseudo-justify the abolition of the Khilafah on Islamic grounds. And we're going to discuss how that reformist agenda came about. And the third thing that we're going to have to look at is how the West was trying to impose its values onto the Muslim world. And these are actually, the last 2 points are very relevant to the situation of Muslims in the world today. Next slide, please. Mustafa Kamal was, according to some of his biographers, exposed to Western ideas at a very young age. There are a few biographies in English. Obviously, they are going to be limited in their outlook. And I don't have access to Turkish sources, so really reading biographies of this man in Turkish wasn't available to me. A writer called H.C. Armstrong, who wrote in the early part of the 20th century, claims that Kamal was exposed to Western ideas by French Dominican monks who lived near him in Salonika, that he would go after school and sit with them. Another biographer, Patrick Kinross, and others mention how, as a young military officer, he was sent on a military mission to France, where he was exposed to ideas about Voltaire and Rousseau and became really infatuated with the secular nature of the French Revolution. Next slide, please. But he was also influenced by this man, Zia Golkep, who died in 1924. He was a sociologist, a poet, and a thinker in the Ottoman Khilafah, but he has associated with the Young Turks, and as such, he was implicated in their crimes of World War II and in World War I, and after World War I, he was imprisoned on Malta. At the time the Young Turks assumed power in a coup against Sultan Abdul Hamid II in 1908, he started to propagate his extreme ideas. And really his ideas were about nationalism. He was a proponent of Turkish nationalism. Sultan Abdul Hamid had tried, as the Khilafah was declining, to exercise some power of the Khilafah through pan-Islamism, so reaching out to all areas of the Muslim world to kind of, if you like, project what you might call soft power over the world. He's the Khalifa, he's in Istanbul, he may not have direct control over India, over Indonesia, over the many places in Africa, but he's the Khalifa of the Muslims. So he can project that soft power by pan-Islamism. Gulkap, by contrast, was more interested in pan-Turkism. And he wanted people to see themselves more as Turkish in the Anatolian region of the Khilafah, but as opposed to the way the Ottoman Khilafah had lived, where people were seen as Ottoman, Uthmanis, whether they were in Turkey or in the Hijaz or in Sham or in Iraq or in Egypt or in Morocco or in Bosnia or in Bulgaria, whether you were Muslim or non-Muslim, because more non-Muslims lived in the Uthmani Khilafah than Muslims, you were an Ottoman citizen. So Golkip was challenging this, thinking about more Turkism, and he was also a proponent of secular thought as well. And next slide, please. He was infatuated with the idea of the nation state. Now, remember, this is a man who directly influenced Mustafa Kamal. Okay, and he talks about now the mission of the Turks is nothing but to uncover the pre-Islamic Turkish past, which has remained with people, and to graft Western civilization in its entirety onto it, in order to equal European powers militarily and in sciences and industry. Our only road to salvation is to adopt Western civilization completely. Here you've got a very, very dangerous and confused mindset. The Ottomans were indeed in the 1900s shocked by the rise of Western civilization, their industrialization, their economic success, and their military success. And they had indeed fallen behind in many ways, materially speaking. And people like Gulkip, they started associating the progress of the West and the comparison with the Uthmani Khilafah as being a backwardness of Islam, which is actually a fallacy. It's a false premise. But you can see from the language that he's using, he's completely like brainwashed by this idea in an almost uncritical way. Next slide, please. By the way, this idea of pre-Islamic Turkish nationalism and patriotism is nonsensical, actually. There are other historians who have written the idea that there was no real concept of Turkishness in a way that had retained itself. It was literally a relatively recent thing at that time to think of themselves as Turkish. Nationalism had started to rear its ugly head in the Uthmani Khilafah just in the second half of the 19th century, so from the 1850s onwards. Golkap says, amongst pre-Islamic Turks, patriotism reached in its highest levels. In the future, as in the past, patriotism should be the most important area of morality for the Turks, because the nation and its soul is ultimately the only self-existing unit. Loyalty to the nation must take precedence to loyalty to family or religion. Turkism must be given the highest priority to nation and fatherland. This language is almost identical to the language that Mustafa Kamal started using when he implemented kemalism. But also, it's no surprise then that we see Adolf Hitler praised Mustafa Kamal and his brand of nationalism and was influenced by him and his writings. And you can see nation, fatherland, this very extreme nationalistic kind of idea has gone from Golkap to Kemal to Hitler. Next slide, please.
Dr. Abdul Wahid, so I just like had a this subhanAllah, this quote that you have here is very like profound in the way that he's saying that he's equating what is inherent with your soul to basically be just somebody's DNA, their ethnicity, which is, I don't know if that's what I'm getting from the language he's using here. It's a very kind of materialistic way where it's like, the soul, if you want to think about it more from like a Islamic perspective, then I mean your fitra is what aligns you with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is like, the unseen, something beyond just the
Yeah.
material world, something transcendent. In this quote that I'm seeing here, it's really making me think about the effect that rationalism and empiricism had in the Muslim world. You know, Prior to this, it's also like we had like these reformist movements that you were talking about before, like the kind of earned like a little bit of an infamous title, the Ilm al Kalam Jadid type of movements that utilize Islamic language in many ways to articulate like a rationalist and empiricist paradigm for Islam to take, which is like really it began in Europe, and it was like imported into the Muslim world and kind of rehabilitated with this fancy language.
And we're going to see later on how this crept into the Muslim world. So Golkep obviously got his ideas from somewhere, and they had seeped into the Muslim world over the second half, mainly over the second half of the 1900s, so from 1850s onwards. Before that, these ideas were not really very prevalent. As you rightly say, it is related to DNA. I mean, all nationalism is basically tribalism, isn't it? So, you want your tribe, your family to be dominant, and then you unite with other people who are linked to that tribe, that ethnicity, that nation. So it is no wonder that nationalism and racism often go together very strongly. Now, the other thing that we notice here is the word loyalty. Loyalty must take precedence over loyalty to family and religion. Loyalty, you can say, if you want to use Islamic terminology, al-wala wal-bara, you are literally, for a Muslim, al-wala al-bara, your loyalty is to whom? To Allah and His Messenger, and to Islam, and to the believers. Okay, loyalty is to Allah and His Messenger. Really, it's a loyalty to principle, isn't it? More than anything else, than loyalty to blood. And what you are seeing here in nationalism, and this is the reality of every nation state, your loyalty has to be to nation before anything else, to the flag, to the state, usually in most countries, the biggest punishment is the punishment for treason, where your political loyalty is given somewhere else. Do you think of this guy like Edward Snowden, who was a US intelligence officer who gave away US secrets and has to spend the rest of his life fleeing from the US, hiding somewhere in Russia? Okay, or another US spy working in the CIA called what's his name? Jonathan Pollard, who was actually spying for Israel, and he was sentenced to a huge, long prison sentence for doing that, even though he's American and he's spying for an American ally. But this is unacceptable, to have your political loyalty to another state. So this problem is a serious problem, and I don't know if people really appreciated this. Even today, one of the reasons I've included this is, even today, I don't think people appreciate the fact that loyalty to your nation state is expected to be more than your loyalty to Allah and His Messenger. Next slide, please.
Inshallah.
One of the reasons we need to understand about Mustafa Kamal's rise to power is that an awful lot of people did not realize what this man was doing. So he actually managed to rise through the ranks as an officer, and people are very close to him were aware he had some secular ideas, but they forgave him those ideas because of success in the battlefield. And again, one of the reasons I wanted to include this part that people learn from is that sometimes you see someone, you think they're a strong leader, you think that they've got the interests of their country at heart, but you also see some statements and actions which are problematic. And you end up supporting them, thinking they're doing good, and making excuses for them, and ignoring the problematic things they're saying and doing, only to find it's too late. And this is exactly how it was with Mustafa Kamal. So a lot of people said that he kept his views hidden, and only shared them sometimes with people immediately around him. He was a hero in Gallipoli, and then there were some problems noticed in his behavior, and he was sent into exile for a while. But then he re-emerges after the end of World War I in 1918, and he started stoking ill feeling about a very punitive treaty called the Treaty of Sèvres, which was the post-war treaty where effectively they were cutting off whole segments from the Ottoman Khilafah away from Turkey. So Cyprus, Palestine, Syria, Hijaz, all of it was going to Greece, all of it was going to Iraq, all of it was going to be taken away from Turkey just to leave Turkey alone, and these would be independent countries. So he was stoking ill feeling about that. There was then a war with Greece, and he was seen as a hero in that. And I think we'll be talking about that a little bit later, but just in summary, the important thing to know about this war with Greece is that initially the British were backing Greece against the Ottoman Turks. And then there was a change of government in Britain, and they withdrew the support from Greece. And effectively that gave Mustafa Kamal a victory over Greece. So he was seen as a hero when he came back to Turkey. And he set up a rival center of power in Ankara. So you had the government in Istanbul, and he set up another government in Ankara. Very similar to maybe how you can think of Libya today, where there's a government in Tripoli and a government in Benghazi, and a recipe for disaster. The British, who then ran the next post-war conference called the Lausanne Conference to substitute from the Treaty of Sèvres, invited Mustafa Kamal and the Ankara delegation, as well as a delegation from Istanbul. So they were actually empowering him. And it was in that conference that we'll discuss later that there were many aspects of change to the constitution, which meant some degree of westernization. I've said what I was going to say in the next slide. And but the next slide is very interesting. So there are some quotes here, which look. This is from March 1920. This is Mustafa Kamal in March 1920. The liberation of Istanbul would win the applause of mankind and pave the road to liberation the Islamic world is yearning for, by delivering the seat of the Caliphate from foreign influence. So after World War I, there was a British presence in Istanbul. So the Khalifa was very constrained there. So he is kind of like talking in terms of resisting the occupier, resisting the colonial power, and empowering the Khilafah. But then in 1922, 2 years later, he's writing to the same colonel who he wrote that original article to, saying, "We will separate the caliphate from the sultanate and abolish the latter," meaning the sultanate. And he then also says, "The issue of the caliphate is the greatest Islamic affair, since it was a leadership that binds all the people of Islam. But it should not be political, because it was completely natural for the position of the caliphate to exist side by side with the authority of the people." So he's talking in very respectful terms about the Khilafah, but he's saying it should be secular. It should not be political. It should just be spiritual. And actually the political power should be with the people. you can see some quite mixed messages that he's giving people. There's not a hint that he's going to abolish the Khilafah here. And this is confirmed by his biographer, Patrick Kinross, who in the next slide, he says, always careful until his military victory was won, to imply in public the orthodoxy of his religious views. Kamal had over the years been speaking more and more freely and critically on the subject of religion. He still professed himself a believer, but a rational believer, for whom Islam was a natural religion in harmony with reason, science, knowledge, and logic. But he also, whilst he praised the Khilafah at one level, when he said it should go, he argued it because he argued that the Khilafah had been controlled by Britain after World War One. And in India, there had been a big debate about the Khilafah. There was a lot of pro-Khilafah sentiment in India. And the Agha Khan, the leader of the Ismailis, global leader of the Ismailis, intervened and very much recognized as a British agent by people over the years, very, very much recognized as such. He spoke publicly at that time about the foreign intervention, about the supporting the Khilafah. So it kind of reinforced this view in Turkey that the Caliph was a colonial stooge, and Mustafa Kamal's anti-colonial kind of stance gave him more support to, in these words of Kinross, cut out this tumor of the Middle Ages, which is a very nasty kind of wording. So he abolishes the Khilafah on the 3rd of March 1924 after a brutal debate. And even if you read accounts of that debate, thuggery by his supporters in pushing this through, threatening and silencing people who oppose this view. And then established his system of kemalism, which there's a debate been ever since, really. Was he the genuine nationalist who opposed Western imperial interference, or a secular nationalist who was bent on destroying the Khilafah, who hid his views? And was the abolition of the Khilafah part of a power struggle, or was it with an ideological intent? Well, we can understand some of that when we see what the man did afterwards. Next slide, please. So he replaced Ottomanism with Kemalism. And there's the next slide. Kemalism had 6 principles: republicanism, populism, nationalism, laicism, meaning an extreme form of secularism, statism, meaning the state is in charge, and reformism. And Kamal himself described it in terms of what he called a kind of Jacobinism, which is the kind of one of the features of the French Revolution, which would confirm that he had become infatuated with some of the ideas around the French Revolution. And it's employing a kind of despotic authoritarian rule in order to overcome the past cultures. And indeed, he did that. To this day, I believe it's a crime to criticize and deny Kemalism. So Kemalism, that's Kemalism in theory. The next slide explains Kemalism in practice. So they abolished the Khilafah in 1924. They secularized the education system in 1924. They abolished Ottoman-style hats in 1925, and he encouraged people to wear the top hat like he was wearing in that photograph. He closed some of the Sufi lodges in 1925. He changed marriage from nikah, religious nikah marriage, according to the Sharia, to civil marriages in 1925. He changed the script. Many people don't know, but the Ottoman Turkish script was the Arabic script. So, Ottoman names, Ottoman poetry, Ottoman laws, Ottoman books were written in an Arabic style script. like Urdu or like Farsi were. He changed that in 1928, banning the Ottoman script, and hence the Turkish script today is using Roman letters. He banned the use of Ottoman titles like Effendi or Bey or Pasha. In 1934, also, he made a law against the wearing of indigenous garments, so traditional Turkish dress or Islamic dress for women. And ultimately, there is a constitutional prohibition in Turkey on the denial of kemalism. So it's a sin, it's a crime to do that. Next slide is just my point that there's evidence that Hitler was influenced by him. Okay, so that kind of takes us to Mustafa Kamal. And you understand that this man abolished the Khilafah. It was justified by some delegates according to Islamic arguments. That is a result of his rise to power, number one. And it's also a result of twisted arguments in fiqh and a colonialist mindset which influenced people towards secularism and nationalism. So our next section we're going to talk about is about the rise of nationalist and secular thought in the Uthmani Khilafah, which ultimately would have led to people like Ziad Golkip and Mustafa Kamal and others in the Khilafah who were influenced by secular thought and nationalistic thought. I have a quote here from the American academic, actually he's a British-American academic who was born in Britain and became an American citizen, Bernard Lewis. Bernard Lewis wrote a book called The Emergence of Modern Turkey. And look at this. Bernard Lewis, by the way, is no fan of Muslims, but he was very beloved of the neocons in America. Bernard Lewis says this: in the 19th century, the Turks thought of themselves primarily as Muslims. Their loyalty belonged to Islam and not to the Ottoman state. The term Ottoman was understood not in a national sense, but in a dynasty sense, like the Umayyads or the Abbasids or Seljuks. The concept of an Ottoman nation, an Ottoman fatherland, as a focus of nationalistic and patriotic loyalty were 19th century inventions under European influence. So Ziya Golkep, talking about a pre-Islamic era Turkish sense of patriotism, is a lie. Lewis is basically saying this was a 19th century invention under European influence, and this was of brief duration, he says. The Turks themselves showed very little national consciousness. Ottomans had no racial arrogance or exclusiveness, no insistence on pure Turkish descent. Islam was the entry requirement which opened the door to real power and societal status to Albanian, Greek, Slav, as well as to Kurd and Arab. So this is a man who is no fan of Islam, Bernard Lewis, but he is explaining that in the Ottoman era, your racial origin, your ethnic origin was not really the ticket to access to societal status. It wasn't a racial state, the Ottoman state. Something has happened under European influence that has made people like Golkip and then Kamal think more in terms of the nation state and Turkish nationalism. And this is actually replicated in the Arabian part of the Khilafah, where Arab nationalism was on the rise. In Mecca, the Ottomans had appointed the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein bin Ali, as the governor of Mecca, the Sharif of Mecca. He was very loyal to Sultan Abdul Hamid II, and he had a problem with the Young Turks. So when World War I broke out, he secretly started corresponding with a British High Commissioner in Egypt called Sir Henry McMahon, agreeing with them that he would start a rebellion against the Uthmani Khilafah during World War I, thereby opening up a second front of battle for the Ottomans to fight and weakening them. And this is when Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, was sent to try and fuel the Arab revolt. So the Arab tribes under Sharif Hussein started fighting the Ottomans, blowing up their railways and creating havoc within the Hijaz and the Bilad al-Sham region. Actually, Hussein was promised Palestine and the Hijaz and Ash-Sham by the British. But then actually, the French were promised Ash-Sham, and the Zionists had already been promised Palestine. So there was a lot of double dealing going on at that time by the British. Hussein was no stranger to double dealing himself. He was, at the same time that he was taking money from the Ottomans, he was taking money from the British. But because of his rebellion and opening up this second front in the Hijaz, the Ottomans lost Jerusalem, they lost Baghdad, they lost Damascus. Ultimately, they lost the Haramain. After the war, Hussein's family were given Jordan. In fact, it is his great-grandson that is the current king of Jordan. And briefly, his family were given ruling in Syria and Iraq, and I think in Egypt as well, but none of those worked out. This next slide indicates the double dealing. One of the reasons I included these anecdotes about the way that these Arab nationalists was encouraged. They were promised all kinds. If two fish in the Tigris are fighting, the Arab proverb says, look for the Englishman. A PhD in deception, usually, these diplomats. And this is a lesson that we need to learn today when we see the things that are happening in the Muslim world. All too often, people believe what they're told by these Western diplomats, when actually, truthfully, they are being played off each other and going to be betrayed. And that's exactly what happens. So this is how Turkish nationalism and Arab nationalism happened in brief. Obviously, there's going to be a lot more detail to it, and we will touch on some of those details later. We're going to talk about the rise of secular ideas in the Uthmani Khilafah. And just bear in mind what kind of world we're living in this time. In 1707, Britain has changed. It's developed the Act of Union, where England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales are unified as the United Kingdom. So there's a big constitutional change within Britain. In 1776, just 69 years later, the US declared independence from Britain and started its own project of the American Republic and its constitution, and it's framed its ideas, its secular thought by Jefferson and others at that time. And then a few years later, there's the French Revolution, and again, European secular thought is kind of, a big talking point of people. There's a lot of political debates and discussions about what is the right model of state and governance, and where the role of religion is in the state. Britain, of course, is a one where it has an established official church where the king is the head of the state and the head of the church. America, a very religious country, but there's no role for religion in the politics. And France, there are many Catholics in France, but their revolution meant a complete abolition of religion from all public spaces. French Revolution, there was many years of turmoil after that, where we saw the rise and fall of Napoleon. And that is where you see a crossover between the ideas and the rise of secular ideas and the spread of French power into other parts of the world. So the next slide, please. So at some point in this era, this is all at the end of the 1700s. So in the 1800s, you start seeing various non-Muslims coming in to the Khilafah, whether in Istanbul or in Beirut or in Cairo or in Bilad al-Sham or in Malta. And often these were missionaries, Christian missionaries, or you had some figures from the Khilafah who would go and travel into Europe and became affected by Western thought in Europe. So in Istanbul, you had the rise of the Young Turk movement in the late 1800s, and many of those Young Turks had been to London or Paris and or had contacts with the French or British embassies in Istanbul. So you can see a transfer of ideas, but also colonial influence in the Khilafah. In Beirut, there was a Father Louis Sheiko, a Maronite priest who went to the UK, but then when he came back, he started introducing education reforms, which then started influencing ideas in Beirut. In Bilad al-Sham, there was Francis Marash, Cornelius van Dyck from the United States, who came in and started spreading ideas which are secular ideas as missionaries. They in turn affected some Christian Arab thinkers, Nasif al-Yazi and Boutros Boustani, and they set up either political movements. Al-Yazi set up Nahda, or Arab Awakening it was called, and Boustani set up the Syrian Scientific Society, where these discussions would happen about scientific thought. And indeed, as you said, Brother Zain, you can see now how some of these ideas start to seep in. And in fact, there were American universities established in Beirut and Cairo in this era, which started spreading these ideas even more. Next slide, please. There were Ottoman thinkers that started propagating these ideas. Khair al-Din al-Tunsi, who died in 1890, was also known as Khair al-Din Pasha. He lived in France for a while, and he observed firsthand the style and manner of politics in the West. And he wrote a comparison between European states and Muslim states, proposing strategies for governance and comparing European political systems. And he advised a moderate kind of approach, adopting selective Western programs and techniques while maintaining traditions in Tunisia which were acceptable to the people. Rafi al-Tahtawi was an Egyptian reformer. He started the Egyptian Nahda movement, and he imported and sought to import Western military, scientific, technical, and educational innovations. And it is thought that Rafi al-Tahtawi influenced Muhammad Abdu and Rashid Rida. So you can see a transference of thinking from Europe to some of these secular thinkers in the Khilafah, to people who were known for a degree of Islamic scholarship, like Abdu and Rida. Next slide, please. Jamaluddin al-Afghani was somebody who, in some ways, he was seen as very Islamic, and he was a pan-Islamist and anti-colonial, but he had very confused ideas about shura, parliamentary democracy. He actually was not anti-Khilafah, but he believed the Khilafah should be with the Arabs, but he was anti the Ottoman Sultanate and saw the need for reforms to reform that. He was actually also very friendly with a British colonialist called Wilfred Scowen Blunt, who described Al-Afghani as a liberal, and he also knew Sir Richard Burton, who was Orientalist British traveller in that region as well. Next slide, please. Mohammed Abdu.
Hold on a
Yes,
second.
brother.
Sorry. Just before we go to the next slide, I wanted to just like kind of like touch on this thing that you were talking about here, where it's like Jamaluddin Afghani. He was somebody who had this like also he used like language of Islam to articulate like anti-colonial points, which was something which is obviously, I mean, like if you're thinking about Afghanistan, I mean, how long was it under like the eyes of the British Empire? So you can understand. I can understand why this type of rhetoric was very popular. Also in kind of the subcontinent, there were certain thinkers that used the same type of language, like Sir Ahmad Khan, not Ahmad Khan Shahid, Sir Ahmad of Aligarh University, as well as other types of activists at this time. I think it's it's important for us to reflect on the reality of what their activism kind of led to. In many ways, they use the language of Islam, but they're advocating in many ways for liberal ideas, for ideas that stem from the Western tradition that do not really have that authenticity or rootedness in Islam, which is something I think we should be aware of today, especially because many times we see speakers kind of articulating the same type of thing. Islam used as language, but unfortunately they don't have that rooted analysis or rooted criticism coming from the Islamic tradition. Instead, it's kind of the critique is made on liberal premises or Marxist premises. I'm sure all of us, we've seen a lot of this coming out with the genocide in Gaza, especially, where a lot of people are drawing on this Western traditions to critique the occupation, and people become attracted to this because it is a critique of the occupation. We can say that it is a critique of the occupation, but on what basis is the critique being made? I think this is something that people should be aware of, that Islam as well offers its own critique, offers its own type of perspective that is not really burdened by these things. If we continue to look to the West or to ideologies and philosophies that are not coming from Islamic tradition, then in many ways we'll find ourselves in the same type of rut. It's not really going forward. So inshallah, it's something that made me think about that. Inshallah, so I'll pass it back.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair. I'm glad you raised that, because this is. I mean, some of these links I'm not making them directly because we would be here for a long time. But you've seen, for example, in the United States, you have a very polarized political spectrum there. You have the kind of more liberal left wing Democrat, and you'll hear Muslims who'll be like praising Bernie Sanders and Ilhan Omar and people like this, and they'll be kind of latching on to some of their principles of justice and fairness and lack of racism and redistribution of wealth, and they'll be justifying them through Islamic arguments. And then you'll see the other side, the Republican right, who are sure, they're more racist, they don't distribute wealth, but they stand for family values. They know a man is a man, a woman is a woman. They are clear on those things. They are so you see Muslims like sometimes arguing, okay, these justifying the positives from the Republican right again on Islamic grounds. Okay, they don't tax so much, and Islam doesn't do tax like the Democrats like to tax loads. So you see this twisting of Islam to fit something which is not Islamic. Fundamentally, both the Republican right and the Democratic left are un-Islamic. And yet you hear Muslims, and sometimes very respected Muslims, kind of trying to justify support for one side or the other through latching on whatever argument from Islam they can. And that thinking has started to affect people back in the 1890s. And it is a part of our decline that Muslims became infatuated with this kind of Western thinking. And Afghani is one of these people, and Abdu, who my next slide is about, is another. So he was an Egyptian scholar. He was considered a revivalist, and he had traveled to Europe, and he was very favorably impressed by Europe. He is quoted once as having said, I went to the West and saw Islam, but no Muslims. And I got back to the East and I saw Muslims, but not Islam. It is said he was a Freemason. I don't know how true that is. But what you find is he's considered to be some kind of Islamic revivalist who, didn't think that the traditional four schools of thought were enough to solve problems, contemporary problems. And okay, there's a merit in that argument, but then Abdu's thinking is so biased to start off with. He's not going to approach the Islamic texts in a unbiased manner. He's going to rather interpret them in a manner that is consistent with his bias. Lord Cromer, who also known as Evelyn Baring, the founder of Baring's Bank, was the governor of Egypt under the British governor of Egypt, and he described Abdu as a man of broad and enlightened views who recognized the necessity for European assistance in the work of reform. So, unfortunately, you've got this guy, and he was a prominent thinker in Al-Azhar. So he is a teacher, and he is respected by people, and he's going to start influencing other people. So the next slide is one of the people who he did influence. So Abdurrahman al-Kawakibi was influenced by both Afghani and Abdu. And most infamously, the next slide, Ali Abdul Razik was influenced by Abdu, and he was educated by him at Azhar. And then Ali Abdul Razik goes on to travel to the UK, and in 1912 studies at Oxford. 1925, he comes back to Egypt. He writes a book called Islam wa Usul al-Hukum, Islam and the Foundations of Governance. In that book, he basically writes down the arguments that people still use to today to basically say, when they try to argue that Islam has no political system, that there's no system of governance, that Khilafah was not a system of governance, rather you can have any system of governance. And he wrote a book on this. Some people even say it might even have been Abdu that wrote the book, but there's no clarity on whether that is true or not. But anyway, this book was considered so nonsensical by his peers in 1925, even heretical, that there was a meeting convened in Azhar of the top scholars where they called him and they refuted every argument that he gave from Islamic texts. And they were so appalled by his twisting of reason on Islam and governance that they actually stripped him of a scholarly status, of his Azhar qualifications, and he was never viewed as a sheikh thereafter. And that book is one where, if you want to see what modernists say today about Islam being secular, you'll see all your arguments go back to that book, basically. There was a British writer called Marmaduke Pickthall. Next slide. He's most famous for doing a translation of the Quran. and he wrote a book called With the Turk in Wartime. And he describes how many English people that he met were very derogatory about Turkish people, about Muslims in Turkey. And when he met people who were Turkish or from the Islamic world, who had been educated amongst Europeans, he often found them very negative. But when he traveled to Turkey and he met young Ottoman men who had no previous interactions with Europeans, he found them independent-minded and found them to be kind of he was heartened by the fact that the young men of his acquaintance had, they weren't the type to seek out Europeans and adopt their cynical and hopeless standpoint towards Islam and the Muslim world, whereas those people from Turkey who actually sought out or traveled to Europe, they adopted this cynical and hopeless view towards the Muslim world. And in fact, our next slide summarizes this very well. This was Mustafa Kamal when he went to Europe as part of a delegation. And imagine he goes from the Ottoman state to Europe, and all of these Turkish people are dressed in this kind of caricature of what a European should look like. So quickly do they adopt it. Very shallow mindset, you can see, that succumbs to this. Okay, so we have seen now the rise of nationalistic thought and secular thought within the Ottoman state, within the scholarly circles, and our next slide explains that this starts to creep in to the governance of the Khilafah. So in 1838, there was a treaty called the Treaty of Balta Liman after one of the wars in which the Khilafah had been involved in fighting. And as part of this treaty, reorganization in the Ottoman Empire was part of the kind of wording of the conditions of the treaty. So you started seeing from the 1840 onwards some changes in the way the Ottomans were doing things. So first of all in finance, and then in the civil and criminal code, and then in Ministry of Education and public institutions and universities, and then in factories, and then establishing like an Ottoman bank, very much like you had state banks in and central banks in other countries. And then even in 1858, the decriminalization of homosexuality, and it's actually even still a crime in many European countries. Britain, it didn't become decriminalized till 1967, so more than 100 years later. And many of these laws were influenced by the Napoleonic Code. Napoleon, of course, invaded Egypt and left a legacy there. But right till the end of the Ottoman Khilafah, any of these reforms, even though they're secular, they had to be argued from an Islamic perspective. The Sheikh al-Islam had to say they were okay before they became acceptable. In fact, the Sheikh al-Islam sometimes rejected them, saying he couldn't see an Islamic argument for them. But you can see the influence from the outside as well, because look at the next slide. This is a slide from an American website called the Office of the Historian, where there is an extract from British Foreign State Papers from 1854, where Viscount Palmerston writes to another British diplomat called Sir Strafford Canning, where he praises the reforms that the Ottomans are doing in favor of Protestant Christians. So this is like, if you like, a reform to the Ahlul Dhimma kind of laws, which the British have been clearly lobbying for. This is 1850 odd, okay? So fast track forward, the next slide, please. Fast track forward to the 1870s. These reforms have been going on in the Khilafah. There is British influence and British lobbying at this stage, and the Ottoman state is quite heavily in debt to Britain. And there has been secularization of thought, and there has been British influence amongst people in the upper echelons of the Ottoman state. This is Sultan Abdul Aziz, one of the last of the Khalifas. Probably, I think there were only 5 or 6 after him. And Abdul Aziz had a chief minister called Midhat Pasha. And Midhat Pasha was, before he was in the Ottoman administration, was part of an opposition group known as the Young Ottomans, who eventually they were a secular group, basically. So, and Midhat Pasha was quite influenced and quite in touch with the West, with British diplomats. And there was a fundamental disagreement between Abdul Aziz and Midhat Pasha on certain constitutional reforms and the extent to which the Khilafah would engage with Britain. Abdul Aziz, Allah give him rahmah, overrode his minister, Midhat Pasha, and within 1 week of that decision, the Sultan was found dead. He was accused of having committed suicide, having cut both his wrists, apparently. Now, committing suicide by cutting both your wrists is pretty much unheard of, because if you think about it, if you cut yourself deep enough to sever an artery on one side, your hand's not really going to be strong enough to cut your wrist on the other side. So it's widely considered to have been an assassination. And this is confirmed in the next slide, again from this American's website, the Office of the Historian, which has these historical documents where it picks out some diplomatic documents written in 1877, which talk about Midhat Pasha. Now, remember that Sultan Abdulaziz died in 1876, 1 year before this. So this is a description by an American diplomat of Midhat Pasha. Midhat Pasha was the ideal of Turkish statesmanship, a reformer and a true patriot. He had been a prime favorite with the British embassy and was relied upon to circumvent and bring to naught the machinations imputed to Russia. So Britain and Russia were rivals, and they were rivals looking for influence, and the British got Midhat Pasha to reject some overtures by the Russians. It was he who had compassed the fall of the late Sultan Abdul Aziz and the deposition of Murad V. Abdul Aziz, when he died, I think Murad was his brother, and Murad had a kind of mental breakdown, so was not fit to be the Khalifa after Abdul Aziz. And so Midhat Pasha and others brought in a very young man who they thought would be easy to influence and very naive politically, who was Sultan Abdul Hamid II, a very young man, who had the measure of these people and outdid them politically by a long way. I just want you to go to the next slide. This is in a similar era, 1878, the Congress of Berlin. It is a Congress which is looking to get different European powers to keep their pledges about which countries they invaded or didn't invade, or influence or didn't influence. And this was particularly relevant to the Ottomans in the Balkans. Now, in this portrait of this Congress, you have on the left the British Prime Minister represented, Benjamin Disraeli. In the middle, you have the Kaiser, the German Kaiser. And on the right, you have, with their darbouches on their head, the Ottoman. I want to show this photograph, this portrait, because it represents the fact that even in the 1870s, when the Ottomans were really weak, in debt, in decline, with schisms internally, with Western colonial thought, they are still at the table as a global power. They are still considered a significant global player and global power. So even in their most declined state, they were considered this. When we talk about Khilafah, we don't want to see a revival of an Ottoman Caliphate or a declined Ottoman Caliphate. We would love to see the return of the Khilafah Rashida, Khilafah on the way of prophethood. But it's still important to understand that these caliphates, which were still not on the prophetic method, was still, for hundreds of years, the Ottoman Khilafah was the world superpower. But even in its last 50 to 100 years, it was considered a significant world power, even though it was not the superpower. So World War I happens, and I missed out a huge chunk here, but in World War I, effectively, the Ottomans were on the losing side. The British carved up and French carved up the Ottoman Khilafah with the Sykes-Picot Treaty, where the British would take Palestine, Jordan, and the Hijaz, and Iraq, and the French would take Lebanon and Syria. But what we have after World War I is three things happening at once. These treaties and conferences in Sèvres and Lausanne that we've mentioned before, which were all about carving up the Ottoman territories and putting conditions on them. The war between Greece and Turkey, which saw the rise of Mustafa Kamal, and then the further rise of Mustafa Kamal and the nationalists against the Khalifa in Istanbul. And all this time, Britain has an eye on its rival France, its rival Russia, and its interests in India, because that is the jewel in Britain's crown. Next slide, please. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 is basically to carve up the Ottoman state, like I said. So if you read this treaty, you can find it online. There are sections which basically say Turkey has no control over Cyprus, over Palestine, over Syria, over Jordan, over Hijaz, over Iraq, and it's basically cutting off these areas from Turkey and subjugating it completely. 1920, Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, celebrated that Turkey is no more, and the Treaty of Sèvres, the historian David Fromkin said, was for reducing the Ottoman state to almost a non-entity. And in this treaty, as I said before, the Khalifa and his administration are weak. They are they are occupied by the British in Istanbul, and they're being portrayed as having accepted this treaty and selling out. And that is exploited by Mustafa Kamal. The Greeks then rebel. Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, is in charge, and he argues that the Greeks should be supported. Greece was the birthplace of Western thinking, and he was like, we must support Greece against the Turks. But there was a difference of view in the British cabinet about that. And in fact, by the time that the war was established, Lloyd George was out of office, and the British were basically withdrew their support from Greece. Mustafa Kamal, the Turkish leader, then wins and is seen as a hero. Some people say that this was a deliberate strategy by the British to empower Mustafa Kamal. This may be true, but I have not, in my own independent reading and research, come across the evidence for that. Next slide, please. 1922 is the conference which is there to replace the Lausanne Treaty. Now, this is very important because in this conference, what you can see is three things happening. One is Ankara, where Mustafa Kamal is the leader, is being empowered over Istanbul. Right? Istanbul is being undermined. Government is meant to be in Istanbul, but the British invite both Istanbul and Ankara to the conference negotiations. The second thing is the British are going to be extremely punitive against the Turks. And we're going to see some quotes later which illustrate this from the British leader of the British delegation, Lord Curzon. And the third thing is, there is evidence that in this treaty, there was strong negotiations for a westernization in Turkey, which ultimately would have led to the abolition of the Khilafah. Now, when you look at the actual treaty wording for a layperson like me, you don't always see this, but Nurullah Ardich, in his book, The Islam and the Politics of Secularism, the Caliphate and Middle Eastern Affairs, mentions that Curzon wanted Turkey to adopt Western governmental and administrative standards. And if you move on 2 slides, please. This illustrates the article in the Lausanne Treaty which mentions this. So article number 27, no power or jurisdiction in political, legislative or administrative matters shall be exercised outside the Turkey by the Turkish government. So they've got to give up all power over previous lands that were part of the Ottoman Khilafah for any reason whatsoever over the nationals of territory placed under the sovereignty or protectorate of other powers signatory to the present treaty, or nationals of treaty of territory detached from Turkey. It is understood that the spiritual attributions of Muslim religious authorities are in no way infringed. So effectively, they are giving up all political power from the lands that were once part of the Ottoman Khilafah, except what remained as Turkey. And the treaty pays lip service to maintaining the spiritual power of the Khalifa. But in the next slide, you see a early draft of the treaty and the wording which says that no power of jurisdiction in political legislation or administrative matters will be exercised by the government or authorities of Turkey for whatever motive, especially for reasons of belief. Okay, so it's in the draft, it's explicit that actually belief, meaning religion, should be out. So this is an explicit thing in the draft about secularization in the Khilafah, whereas in the final it's a kind of implicit. Now, this then generated a debate at the time as to whether or not there should be no caliph. Next slide, yeah. No caliph or an alternative spiritual caliph only. The British, writing in from India, the British had a handbook on the rise of Islam in the Caliphate, which in India it has this memo which discusses this issue, because there's obviously a huge number of Muslims in India at that time, and they had very strong feelings towards the Khilafah. The Khilafah movement was going to start at this sort of time, supporting the Khilafah, which is being undermined by Britain as they saw it. So they said the central issue as far as the Indian office was that the spiritual authority of the Caliphate was that the spiritual authority of the Caliphate is separate from its temporal authority. So this is the issue they're discussing. But what they say in this is that neither from the history of the Khilafah nor the utterance of present-day authorities on Muhammadan law, on Islamic law and tradition, does it appear the Khalifa can be regarded as a spiritual ruler only. Okay, so the British are identifying a problem. You want to call him a spiritual ruler like the Pope, but there's nothing in Islamic jurisprudence that restricted his rule to just spiritual rule. Okay, so the British Handbook goes on to basically say it may become clear that the Caliphate as an institution is dead, as was the Holy Roman Empire. And then he puts a Latin quote in there, which means a voice but no substance. So there's this debate going on as to whether or not he should just be a spiritual head, but it doesn't really there isn't really a justification for that Islamically. But there's discomfort in India. The next slide, please. Edwin Montagu, who's the Secretary of State for India, says the feeling on the future of Turkey is growing apace in India. And it's looking to the Muslims in India like the British Empire is embarking on a campaign which is not just anti-Turkish, but anti-Muhammadan, anti-Muslim, anti-Islam. Curzon, in the next slide, is actually quoted. He's writing to Lord Cromer, and he says, look, we're not in Constantinople, and even if we could replace the Caliph, there's no guarantee the Muslims would accept it. So there's this debate amongst them about what to do about the Khilafah. Jonathan Lawrence, next slide please, describes how Sharif Hussein was being touted as a future Caliph, and he believed that as the Turkish regime in Ankara was becoming more secular, that they might even consider appointing him as the Khalifa if that fell. And when the Khilafah fell on the 3rd of March 1924, he actually falsely claimed the Turkish government would back him. So he declared himself as a Khalifa on the 5th of March 1924. But this was not something that was viable, because the Muslims in Bilad al-Sham even were said to be supportive of the Ottoman Khalifa. Abdul Majid the second was considered to be by the Muslims in Syria, in Damascus, to be the legitimate Khalifa. So Sharif Hussein's bid to be Khalifa didn't succeed, and in fact, after he'd done that, the British pretty much withdrew support to him and fully backed the Al Saud family, who eventually took over as well. So we are moving on at a pace now, coming towards the end of my presentation, and it's pretty depressing reading, seeing how these forces of colonialism, secularism, nationalism all collude, and we have traitors within the Khilafah who deceive and undermine and weaken, whether that is Midat Pasha, whether that is Mustafa Kamal, whether that is Sharif Hussein. But as Muslims, next slide please, we look to these things not just historically, but spiritually as well. Next slide please, Brother Zain. There's a silver lining to these clouds. We remind ourselves that وَاللَّهُ غَالِبٌ عَلَى أَمْرِهِ وَلَكِنْ أَكْثَرَ النَّاسِ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. Allah has full power over his affair, but most of mankind don't know it. So, despite the fact that this is a disaster for us, and indeed the last century of misery, what's happening in Gaza today, what's happening in Palestine generally today, what happened in Syria in the past, what's happening in Sudan today, the difficulties and hardships facing the Muslims in Egypt, the divisions across the Muslim world that have conspired together to keep us weak, divided, colonized and subjugated, that have lost Al-Masjid al-Aqsa, all came about from what happened in World War I and the demise of the Khilafah and the forces of secularism, nationalism and betrayal and colonialism that we've discussed. But Allah has full control over his affairs, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will move things to return them. Because Allah, next slide please, has made us a promise in Quran. Wa'ad Allah, He has promised, Allah has promised, الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا مِنْكُمْ وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ, those of you who do good deeds, believe and do good deeds, لَيَسْتَخْلِفَنَّهُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ, that He will give the authority, the succession on the earth, istikhlaf, where Khilafah comes from. He will establish Khilafah in the earth. كَمَا اسْتَخْلَفَ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ, that like he established those before you. So just as he established Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam from Mecca after the Hijrah in Al-Madinah, and established him in Al-Madinah as the first Dawla Islamiyah, the first Islamic state, just as he established the Banu Israel in Al-Quds after he liberated them from Fir'aun. Allah will establish those who believe and do good deeds in political authority and Islamic authority in the world. Again, وَلَيُمَكِّنَنَّ لَهُمْ دِينَ لَهُمُ الَّذِي ارْتَضَى لَهُمْ, that He, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, will make them, establish for them their deen, which He has chosen for them and which He is pleased with, which is Islam. So He'll not just establish them in authority, He'll establish their deen for them. And the consequences of that will be وَلَيُبَدِّلَنَّهُمْ مِنْ بَعْدِ خَوْفِهِمْ أَمْنًا, that the fear that they are suffering will be replaced by aman, by security. So this is a promise from Allah that the Khilafah will come back, the deen will be established, and that the misery and fear and insecurity that those people living in before that will be replaced by security. And we similarly, next 2 slides down please, Brother Zain, we similarly find the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has promised this in a long hadith mentioned in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, that after Nubuwah there will be Khilafah ala minhaj al-Nubuwah, and after Khilafah ala minhaj al-Nubuwah there will be mulkan adhan, hereditary ruling, and then after the hereditary ruling there will be mulkan jabriyatan, the oppressive rule, and Allah will let that last for as long as He wishes, and then He will lift it when He wishes, and then after the period of oppressive rule which the Muslims are living under now, there will be a Khilafah ala minhaj al-Nubuwah. So for us as Muslims, it is vital that we look to our deen, to our aqeedah, our trust in Allah, our tawakkul in Allah, the promise of Allah, the promise of His Messenger, that this terrible situation, which is encapsulated in the event of the 3rd of March 1924, will not remain forever. And indeed, next slide please, Brother Zain, when the Khilafah returns, it will eventually settle as its capital in Bayt al-Maqdis, according to a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, narrated by Ibn Asakir from Masira bin Jalis, where the Prophet ﷺ said in the meaning that this matter, Khilafah, will continue after him in Medina, and then to Asham, and then to Iraq, and then to the city by which he means Constantinople, Istanbul, and then to Bayt al-Maqdis. And when it reaches Bayt al-Maqdis, it will have reached its natural resting place, and no people who remove it from their land will ever get it back again. So, to end with my final slide, that Bayt al-Maqdis will be the future capital of the Khilafah. It will return, and we pray that we learn lessons from this miserable century and more, where we had faced decline, we had faced colonization of our land, of our ruling, of our governments, and of our minds and our thoughts. And anything good I've said is from Allah, and the mistakes are all mine. Subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdika astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.
Jazakallahu khairan, Abdul Wahid, for sharing this presentation with us. SubhanAllah, it's like, this is jammed packed with information, giving you a wide view of all the political history and all the context leading up to the abolition of the Khilafah and the dissolution of the Uthmanis. It's very critical that we understand that where we are today, it is the precipitation of events that, obviously have happened in the past. We need to understand, really our history. It's very unfortunate that, I'll say for myself first, I've definitely, delved more into Islamic history with the past few years. And, the amount of information and the amount of, the importance of it, its relevancy to us today, being, in the situation where we see so much chaos and disruption and disunity and confusion, a lot of darkness in the Muslim Ummah today. Reading into, the history of the Muslim Ummah, especially the more recent past, 100 years, 200 years, will demystify a lot of the things that we see today. So jazakallah khairan, inshallah, inshallah there'll be barakah in this, and we really appreciate you coming on to discuss this.
Jazakallah khair. Jazakallah khair. Like I said to you before, brother, it's not about just the history. It's about,
Yes.
if we understand how these forces collude, we can see that nationalism and the nation state, these ideas are things that corrupted the Muslim thinking, which directly led to division. Secular thought being adopted in a very kind of shallow way, in a very superficial way, which which influenced Islamic scholarship, and we can still see some of these things existent today amongst some people who may have studied Sharia in prestigious institutions, but they get influenced by bias, and these are very important things for us to understand. Again, the treachery that can exist in Muslim countries by the people in those various administrations who are influenced and subverted by the Western powers. So we can see a lot of these things going on today, and so the lessons are so important for us to learn.
Yes. I also wanted to bring up, I was hoping that, you'd also mention, although these, if you're going to go to, the bookstore, or if you're going to go to, the library bookstore, oftentimes we'll see, these figures, definitely they had, huge influence. People like Jamaluddin Afghani, Muhammad Abdo, they're usually mentioned. But a lot of times, I think people today, in terms of, reconstituting our, critique of the modern nation state, of modernity, of, secularism, and all of these things that are completely, in many ways, that they're contradictory to Islam, that they have, no rootedness in the Quran, in the Sunnah, and the tradition that we're inheriting from the ulama of the past. I think it's, we could really benefit a lot by also re-examining some of the works and some of the, the activism of ulama, for example, Mustafa Sabri, rahimahullah, who, he was very integral in kind of, combating this rationalism, empiricism, this secular mindset that, he first did that in Turkey. I said Shaykh al-Islam because he was appointed by the Uthmani Dawlat to be, pretty much the head of, basically the Sharia affairs, interpreting and, coming up with new fatwa and, the direction that that Islam is going to take in many ways. He combated this in Turkey. But eventually, after Ataturk establishes the Republic of Turkey, then, he stays there for a while, basically trying to combat this, trying to, do whatever he can to take people back onto the right direction, right understanding. Eventually, he is exiled, and I think rather he leaves by choice, because, it was leading up to the point where he was about to be exiled. So he goes to Egypt. Unfortunately, he sees the same thing going on there.
He was threatened, wasn't he? He was pretty much, he would have been threatened. So yes, you're right.
Yeah. So it's we do have these, we have these voices, basically, these ulama who they were reacting to these situations. And I think, it shows how much impact these different ideologies have had in the Muslim world, that the first, basically, when you're talking about the period, who are the important thinkers of this period? The important thinkers. It's these kind of reformist voices are always at the forefront. when those who have been like, more in line and more, respected within the Islamic tradition that have been authentic to it, they are like, kind of mentioned a little bit as like, an afterthought, which to be honest, the reformist voices did have like, big impact. So, but in terms of, for us as Muslims, we need to know this as well.
So Jazakallah khair. So I think that's absolutely right, and I think the people like Mustafa Sabri Effendi, Sheikh Khizar Hussein from Al Azhar, Sheikh Yusuf Al Nabhani, these were people who kind of recognized that the reformist thinking was dangerous. Unfortunately, as this debate played out, you tend to see an extreme polarization in that anyone with any desire to make ijtihad on contemporary issues and not just simply confine themselves to what has already been adduced by the four schools of thought is seen as a kind of reformist and a heretic on the lines of Afghanu Abdi and Afghani Abdu and the others, whereas in truth it became a very polarized kind of debate. Whereas actually, what is perhaps really necessary is an understanding of the usuli principles that underpinned the four madhabs, and so as to allow people to apply them in as an unbiased way as possible, so that we can actually reconnect with our Islamic heritage and think about contemporary issues in a way that the earlier generations of Muslims did, which led to huge advances in thought and civilization. So this is actually a very, very, very crucial and important thing. And I think what's his name, the Mustafa Sabri Effendi, actually recognized very much the threat from Mustafa Kamal and the secularists, and he unlike many others, he could really see the direction that things were heading in. So Jazakallah khair for this opportunity, Brother Zain. I pray Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings benefit through it to people, inshallah, and look forward to speaking to you again sometime in the future.
Inshallah. With that, brothers and sisters, inshallah, I think we've reached the end of our discussion today. As we're reaching the month of Ramadan, inshallah, please remember to keep our brothers and sisters across the world in your du'as. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it beneficial, bountiful Ramadan for all of us, and make us the ones who, inshallah, we are learning from the past, the mistakes that were done in the past, whatever issues and hardships come in the past. And we are ones who are looking forward to the future with tawakkul in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, knowing that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has spoken the truth, that the capital of the Khilafah of the Muslim Ummah, the leadership for the Ummah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which includes, of course, those who believe in him and those who are considered Ummah al-Da'wah. Really, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, of course, is the leader of all mankind. Inshallah, this Khilafah on the methodology of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam will soon be sitting with its capital in Bayt al-Maqdis, bi'idhnillah. Inshallah. Jazakallahu khairan again, Abdul Wahid, for coming on. And assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
لا لن يطول الظلام ديننا لن يضام نحن جيل همام نحن فينا عمر لا 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 لن يطول الظلام ديننا لن يضام نحن جيل همام نحن فينا عمر صبح بدا نور ظهر نجم وشمس وقمر ألقى على الدنيا الدرر هذا عمر كل البرايا تنتظر أيامه البيض الغرر كي تستفيد من العبر. هذا عمر، هذا عمر. لا، لن تدوم الجراح، بل سيأتي الصباح. نحن أهل الكفاح، نحن فينا عمر. لا، لن تدوم الجراح، بل سيأتي الصباح. نحن أهل الكفاح.